the shifting global order, migrants, bankers, and the rise of new powers. In recent years, the United Kingdom has seen a significant influx of migrants, reflecting larger global migration patterns. These movements are partly driven by conflicts, economic inequality, and environmental crises. However, while this mass migration captures headlines and stokes political debate, the true architects of global shifts remain largely unnoticed. The powerful financial elite, particularly the bankers of the City of London, who are shaping a new global order. As we witness an ongoing global war not between nations, but between the ultra-wealthy 1% and the rest of the world, tensions between the rich and poor are growing. Meanwhile, as former colonial powers like the UK and France lose their foothold in Africa and Asia, new powers like China, Russia, and Turkey are stepping in, offering a new but equally precarious phase for the exploited regions of the world. Migration in the UK's changing landscape. The influx of migrants into the UK has become a flashpoint in national politics, feeding into debates about sovereignty, economics, and identity. According to the UK Office for National Statistics, net migration to the UK reached over 600,000 in 2022, driven by both refugees from conflict zones like Syria and Afghanistan, and economic migrants seeking better opportunities. Critics argue that this wave of immigration is overrunning the country, straining public services, and changing the social fabric. However, migration is largely a consequence of broader global inequalities, wars, and crises, many of which were rooted in or exacerbated by the very colonial and imperial policies of the UK and its allies. But the narrative of migrants overrunning the UK often distracts from a larger, less visible force at play. The elite financial institutions, particularly those concentrated in the City of London. These entities, comprising powerful banks, hedge funds, and corporations, have long exerted outsized influence over global economic policies. The City of London functions as a financial hub that is not just British, but transnational, making decisions that affect the global economy. In many ways, these bankers and financiers are orchestrating a new global order, one that benefits the ultra-wealthy 1% while widening the gap between the haves and have-nots. The 1% versus the 99%, a global struggle. We are witnessing a global war not between nations, but between the 1% and the 99%. This idea echoes movements like Occupy Wall Street, which in 2011 brought attention to the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. According to Oxfam, the world's richest 1% hold more wealth than the rest of the global population combined. This concentration of power has serious implications, as it allows the elite to shape policies on everything from taxation to environmental regulation to military conflicts. This global struggle manifests in various ways. The financial elite dictate wars and geopolitical decisions, often behind closed doors. The Iraq War, for example, was heavily influenced by the interests of major oil companies and defense contractors. More recently, decisions regarding the conflict in Ukraine or tensions in the South China Sea have financial motivations that benefit the few at the expense of the many. The global 1% essentially steer world leadership, using political figures as intermediaries to carry out their decisions. If nuclear war doesn't bring about humanity's end, the rising inequality and disenfranchisement could lead to massive uprisings and revolutions. From the Arab Spring in the 2010s to recent protests in France and the US, we've seen how economic hardship and political corruption can trigger widespread unrest. As the gap between the rich and poor grows, these uprisings could intensify into global revolutions. History shows that when elites grow too detached from the plight of the masses, their arrogance often leads to their downfall, a lesson learned in the French and Russian revolutions. The decline of Western colonial powers. While the global elite play their own dangerous game, former colonial powers like the UK and France are losing their grip on Africa and Asia. Once the dominant players in the colonization of these regions, they now face growing competition from new powers: China, Russia, and Turkey. China's Belt and Road Initiative, Russia's military engagements, and Turkey's growing influence in Africa have all but replaced the traditional presence of the UK and France on the continent. China has established a vast economic presence in Africa, investing in infrastructure projects in exchange for access to resources. Russia, meanwhile, has expanded its influence through military partnerships and strategic alliances, particularly in countries facing internal conflict, such as the Central African Republic. Turkey, leveraging historical and cultural ties, has increased its presence across the Horn of Africa and West Africa, bolstering its defense industry in the process. This shift is part of a broader reordering of global power, with traditional Western colonizers ceding space to emerging non-Western actors. However, this new era of engagement with Africa is far from altruistic. Like the European powers before them, China, Russia, and Turkey are primarily motivated by access to Africa's vast natural resources, oil, gas, minerals, and agricultural land. As long as corruption remains entrenched in political systems, Africa may simply trade one set of exploiters for another. Africa's struggle and the new era of exploitation. Africa has long been a battleground for foreign powers seeking to exploit its resources, and its people continue to bear the brunt of this exploitation. The promises made by new powers like China and Russia of development and progress often ring hollow. For many Africans, the hope for a miracle, an escape from the cycle of poverty and corruption, remains elusive. According to the United Nations, 433 million people in sub-Saharan Africa live in extreme poverty, and that number continues to grow despite foreign investment and aid. Corruption, both within Africa and in the foreign powers seeking to control it, perpetuates this cycle of exploitation. In countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where mineral wealth should have led to prosperity, foreign powers and local elites alike have siphoned off wealth for personal gain. This pattern repeats itself across much of the continent, leading to a sense of disillusionment among the African population. Though new powers may have replaced the old colonial rulers, the mechanisms of exploitation remain largely the same. As long as global systems continue to favor the 1%, whether in London, Beijing, or Moscow, Africa's long struggle for genuine liberation will continue. Conclusion. The current global order is marked by a growing divide between the 1% and the 99%, with powerful financial elites shaping policies that serve their own interests. Meanwhile, former colonial powers like the UK and France are losing influence in Africa and Asia, replaced by emerging powers like China, Russia, and Turkey. However, the long history of exploitation on these continents is unlikely to end soon. As long as corruption remains deeply ingrained in human nature and global systems continue to serve the interests of the few over the many, the struggle between the powerful and the oppressed will persist, whether in the UK, Africa, or beyond. Yet, history has shown that such imbalances cannot last indefinitely. The arrogance of the elite, their detachment from the masses, may very well lead to their eventual downfall, as uprisings and revolutions become not just a possibility, but an inevitability.